My husband's creepy coworker started stalking me after my husband passed away, and I accidentally fell for him. I remember sitting at my husband's funeral when I saw one of his coworkers in the back staring at me. My late husband had actually warned me about him, saying he was obsessed with me. Immediately after the funeral, I went insane at first, throwing out our furniture and destroying belongings because everything reminded me of my husband, and that's how he got me. Each time I went outside, that coworker was there. He'd offer to pay for my coffee. He'd offer to help me move the new couch. He became my emotional support without me even realizing it. I remember the day I grabbed coffee with him. He acted like a true gentleman. I caught myself truly enjoying the moment, but when I went home, that's when the realization hit me. He was taking advantage of me in my most vulnerable state, and I had been too dumb to notice. I started recalling every single time I just ran into him, and realized it was damn near every time I went anywhere. Even places you'd never think to see him, he was there. I started replaying everything in my mind, and realized that he was stalking me, that he was preying on me. And what's even worse is that he was now convinced I was into him because of the fact I literally agreed to grab coffee with him. I felt so stupid about myself. I let a man manipulate me so easily. A man I was literally warned about time and time again by my husband. That night I became determined. I was going to get this psycho out of my life so I could grieve in peace. I was terrified, I have to admit, but I was also set on living my life as normal and showing him I was not afraid and that I could stand my own ground. I remember going out to the grocery store the next day, and as anticipated, he was there. As I reached for a box of cereal, I felt like someone was watching me. At first, I shook off the feeling. I thought I was just being paranoid, but then out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure. It was him. At first, I pretended not to see him. My heart started beating faster. I hoped he would just go away. But as I moved to the next aisle, there he was again, standing by the pasta section, peeking around the shelves. The moment I looked up, he ducked behind a display of tomato sauce, trying to appear casual. I had a feeling he was once again here to just somehow run into me. I continued shopping. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was there, always pretending to be looking at something nearby. He picked up a box of spaghetti, examined it, and then put it back, all the while keeping me in his peripheral vision. I turned into the next aisle, and moments later he followed. This time he was looking at the spices. He picked up a jar of oregano, then basil, then oregano again. I felt his eyes on me whenever he thought I wasn't looking. The final straw was when I reached the dairy section. As I grabbed a carton of eggs, I saw him in the reflection of the glass doors, standing a few feet away, pretending to check the expiration dates on yogurts. Our eyes met in the reflection, and for a split second he froze. Then, as if he realized he'd been caught, he quickly ducked behind a display of cheese and knocked over a stack of shredded packages. I couldn't take it anymore, so I left my cart at the front of the store, my only thought being to get out of there as quickly as possible. But just as I reached the exit, I heard his voice behind me. He called out to me and asked me to wait up. Then he proceeded to try to make a conversation. It always opened up with a "fancy seeing you here." Most of the times before this, I let the conversation go on way too long, and this was exactly how this psycho allowed himself to be so brave. This time, however, I ended our conversation short and told him I had to go finish more errands. I didn't wait for his response. Once I was safely in my car, I locked the doors and sat there for a moment. After that day, I stopped going grocery shopping there. Then I started seeing him at the coffee shops that I went to regularly. He often sat at a table by the window. Each time he acted like our encounters were just coincidences. Weeks went by, and his appearances became more frequent. I tried to ignore him, but his persistence wore me down. One evening after a particularly rough day, I found myself at the coffee shop again. The memories of my late husband David were overwhelming, and I felt so vulnerable. As if on cue, the coworker was there. He looked genuinely concerned. He asked me if I was okay and told me I looked like I could use a friend, and since we had already grabbed coffee, maybe I wouldn't mind if he sat with me for a while. Against my better judgment, I nodded and let him sit with me. We talked for hours, and for a brief moment, I felt a bit more normal since David died. When he suggested we continue our conversation at his place, I hesitated but eventually agreed. The loneliness was unbearable, and I craved human connection. We ended up in his apartment. It was a small but neatly kept space. I sat on his couch while he went to grab some glasses of wine. The warmth of the drink slowly eased the tension from my body. I knew what I was doing was wrong, that I had warned myself I wouldn't do something like this again, but here I was. He watched me and said that it must have been a rough few months for me. I nodded and felt a lump in my throat. I opened up about how hard it was losing David. It truly felt like a part of me died with him. I feel so lost and alone now. He told me how understandable that was and talked highly of David. He acknowledged how he saw something truly special between us. I choked back tears as he spoke and told him how often I replayed our last moments together and wondered if there was something that I could have done better, and told him how guilty I felt by even being here talking with him. Then he reached out and held my hand. At first, I jumped at the thought of him touching me. Then he said that grief wasn't linear. He reassured me that it's messy and complicated, and that there was no right or wrong way to feel. He then looked me in the eyes and said that he knew how much I loved David, but now I had to take care of myself. He made me feel safe in that moment. His sincerity was disarming. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly seen and understood. I told him thank you, and how much it meant to hear that. I spent a few more hours opening up to him about my thoughts and fears. One thing led to another, and we slept together. But as the sun rose and I heard the birds chirping, reality hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt regretful for what I'd done. I felt like I had betrayed David. I told him that this was a mistake, and that I was still grieving David. I told him that I couldn't do this anymore. His expression darkened for a moment, but then he nodded, and his smile returned. He said he understood, and that we could take it slow, but he didn't understand. Not really. After that night, his obsession grew. He started sending me letters, each one more desperate than the last. He left gifts at my door, flowers, chocolates, even a locket with our initials engraved. One day, while I was presenting a crucial project update, I noticed movement outside the conference room's glass walls. My heart sank as I recognized him. He was standing there with a bouquet of flowers flowers. He spotted me through the glass and gave me a small wave. I nodded slightly back at him and gestured that I was busy. I hoped he would understand and leave, but instead, he took a seat in the waiting area, the bouquet resting on his lap. I continued with my presentation, but his unexpected visit distracted me. After what felt like an eternity, the meeting finally wrapped up. I gathered my notes and walked out of the conference room. I went to the waiting room to see him welcoming me with a grin. I asked him what he was doing there, and he said he wanted to surprise me. He then asked me out to lunch and tried to hand me the bouquet of flowers. I took them, but told him that I was very busy today with back-to-back meetings. I couldn't step out right then. His smile faded, and he asked me again with a hint of frustration in his voice. He tried to convince me that it would just be a quick lunch and said I couldn't possibly be that busy. I was beginning to lose patience. I said that I appreciated the gesture, but my project was really important. I proposed another time. That didn't sit well with him. He said that I always said that, and that other time never came. His voice grew louder, saying that he had come all the way here for me, and I couldn't even spare an hour for him. A few of my coworkers were starting to notice and tune into our conversation. I tried to calm him down. I asked him to understand that it wasn't personal and that I just couldn't leave at the moment. He took a step towards me and lowered his voice. He said it was always something, and how he always tried to be here for me and support me, but I kept pushing him away. I told him that I wasn't pushing him away and pressed to talk about this another time. He threw his tantrum, eventually agreed, and walked out. His behavior was becoming more hostile, and I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. A few days after the incident at my workplace, I decided I couldn't take any more chances. His behavior was becoming unsettling, and I knew I had to take action. I walked into the local courthouse. My heart pounded as I approached the clerk's desk. I asked the lady for a restraining order, and she told me to fill out some forms first. I took a seat in the waiting area. I opened the folder I brought with me. Inside were copies of the letters he had sent me, photos of the gifts he'd left at my door, and a detailed description of his behavior from me and my coworkers who witnessed the incident at work. When the clerk brought over the forms, I filled them out and included every unwanted advance. When I finished, I returned the forms to the clerk, who reviewed them quickly. When the judge called on me to review my request for the restraining order, I told him everything. I started with the grocery store incident and the coffee shop. I told him how he would follow me around, pretending our encounters were coincidental. Then things escalated when he showed up at my workplace with flowers and got upset when I couldn't have lunch with him. He then asked me if I had any evidence of the incidents. I told him I did and handed him my folder. He then said that there wasn't any evidence of him being a threat or causing any harm in those documents. My heart dropped. I pleaded for him to accept it since he was clearly stalking me and told him how I was scared of what he would do next. The judge said he understood my concern, but it wasn't enough to grant a restraining order at that time. I left the courthouse feeling defeated. Despite my best efforts, I was still vulnerable, and this was terrifying. As weeks turned into months, his behavior became more unpredictable. The messages he left were no longer just desperate, they were threatening. He was convinced that we were meant to be together, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. My heart was pounding. I realized that someone was breaking into my house. I scrambled out of bed, grabbed my phone from the nightstand, and ran to the bathroom. I locked myself inside and fumbled the phone to dial 911. I told them immediately that there was someone in my house and begged them to send help. I could hear his voice on the other side of the door. He was enraged. He banged on the door, shouting for me to open it and saying we were meant to be together. He asked me why I couldn't see it. The lady operator told me to be still, and that help would be on the way. The door shook as he pounded on it. He tried to break it down. I pressed myself against the cold tile floor. My heart was racing. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Eventually, the pounding stopped, and I heard footsteps retreating. When the pounding finally stopped, I heard the sirens approaching. When the police finally arrived, he was gone. They took my statement and began a search for him. They assured me they would find him, and I tried to take some comfort in that. It didn't take long to find him. He was arrested a few blocks away. He looked disheveled and was carrying a knife. The evidence was damning. He had broken in with the clear intention of stabbing me. They later found out that he had a notebook filled with pages upon pages of obsessive notes about me, my daily routines, places I visited often, and even details about my friends and family. There was a detailed map of my neighborhood, with my house marked and various routes highlighted. Alongside it was a set of photos, shots of me at home, at work, and even at the grocery store. Finally, they revealed a small black duffel bag. Inside were zip ties, duct tape, and a large hunting knife. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the full extent of his intentions. The reality of the situation was overwhelming, but knowing that his deranged plans were now exposed and that he would face justice provided a small measure of relief. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but I remained deeply shaken. I realized just how close I had come to being seriously hurt, or worse. The experience left me with a sense of vulnerability that I couldn't shake. In the months that followed, I took steps to regain control of my life. I moved to a new house, installed security systems, and got therapy to help process the trauma. Gradually, I began to heal, but the scars of that night and of the months of stalking that preceded it were always with me. I learned to cherish David's memories without allowing them to overshadow my life. I found strength in myself I hadn't known existed, and while the future still felt uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I would never let fear dictate my life again.